In our headlines on this Wednesday afternoon, May 3rd. The leaders of South Korea and neighboring Japan will be meeting here in Seoul starting May 7th for talks on a range of bilateral and regional issues of mutual interest amid global uncertainties. Meanwhile, medical workers here, with the exception of nurses, are launching partial protests in light of the unilateral passage of the Nursing Act by the opposition-led parliament. And US stocks lose significant ground in the latest session as investors question the stability of the American banking system as JP Morgan Chase acquires First Republic Bank. President Yoon Suk-yeol is hosting his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida starting this Sunday for talks that the latter hopes will impart greater momentum to bilateral ties. Our foreign affairs correspondent Choi Min-jung reports.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will be visiting South Korea at the end of this week to meet with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. This is according to Seoul's presidential office on Tuesday. Kishida will be paying a working visit for 2 days starting Sunday, with the summit anticipated to take place on the first day. Japan's foreign ministry also announced the trip in a press release, stating the two leaders agreed to resume regular visits to each other's country, or what they call shuttle diplomacy. The upcoming visit will be the first by a Japanese prime minister for a bilateral meeting in 12 years. Talking to reporters earlier on Tuesday, the Japanese leader said the summit will be a good opportunity to exchange honest opinions on ways to develop Seoul-Tokyo relations.
I expect it will be a great opportunity to give impetus to our shuttle diplomacy and have a heart-to-heart exchange of our views on accelerating Japan-South Korea ties and drastically changing the global situation.
Now, eyes are on whether this will lead to a sincere apology from Japan for the use of forced labor during its occupation of Korea. During the previous summit in Tokyo, Yoon and Kishida were able to mend soured ties, as the South Korean president proposed a plan to compensate the Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through a third party instead of the Japanese companies held responsible. However, the summit concluded without a sincere apology or response from Japan. Seoul's foreign ministry said Tuesday that it expects Seoul-Tokyo ties to improve further in the future as there are more opportunities for the leaders to meet. Later this month, South Korea, Japan, and the US will reportedly hold a trilateral summit on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Hiroshima. There, the nations are expected to discuss security cooperation against North Korea's growing nuclear threats. The three-way talk comes amid heightened diplomatic tensions as North Korea, China, and Russia criticized Yoon and Biden's new deterrence strategy, dubbed the Washington Declaration, inked during their recent summit in Washington. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, one more victim of sexual slavery by Japan's wartime military has passed away. This is according to the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family on Tuesday, which added her personal details are not being shared at the request of her family. Out of the 240 victims registered with the Korean government, now only 9 remain, and they are all in their 90s. The ministry has reaffirmed its commitment to the interests of these victims and their dignity. In other news, President Yoon Suk-yeol was at the opening ceremony of the Asian Development Bank's 56th annual meeting earlier on this Wednesday in the city of Incheon here in Korea. Addressing finance leaders and relevant officials from the public and private sectors, President Yoon highlighted Korea's commitment to broader regional collaboration to tackle post-pandemic challenges, including supply chain disruptions, the digital divide, and the climate crisis. To take a listen.
한국 정부는 인태 전략에서 밝힌 바와 같이 포용, 신뢰, 호혜의 3대 협력 원칙을 바탕으로 인태 지역의 경제 개발 협력에 적극 기여하고자 합니다.
The Asian Development Bank's latest annual meeting is the first in-person event since the start of the pandemic, and it runs until this coming Friday. Here on the local front, medical workers, with the exception of professional nurses, are taking to the streets on this Wednesday to protest the recent passing of the Nursing Act by the opposition-led parliament. Our political correspondent Lee Si-hoo explains.
A total of 13 associations of doctors and nursing assistants in South Korea are going on a partial strike on Wednesday. They are protesting against the Nursing Act, which is aimed at giving nurses more independence in their duties. Members of groups like the Korea Medical Association and the Korean Licensed Practical Nurses Association are calling on President Yoon to veto the bill. They are working shortened hours and using their annual leave to take part in rallies across the country in the afternoon. They have warned of a second partial strike on May 11th and later a general strike if the president does not veto the bill.
If our request isn't accepted despite this much resistance, we will carry out a 4 million person strong general strike on the 17th.
Partial strikes are being carried out by members of local clinics on a voluntary basis to minimize inconvenience to patients. The general strike will also involve members of larger university hospitals. Last week, the opposition-controlled National Assembly passed the Nursing Act despite strong opposition from the ruling bloc. The act seeks to improve nurses' working conditions by defining their roles and duties separately from the Medical Service Act, which puts them, quote, under the guidance of physicians. It also defines the duties of nurses and nursing assistants separately. Doctors see it as an intrusion of their duties, while nursing assistants are concerned about being left out by the act. 이시후, Arirang News.
On Wall Street, U.S. stocks surrendered substantial ground amid widespread concerns of the country's banking sector, despite news of J.P. Morgan Chase's acquisition of ailing First Republic Bank. Our Song Yujin has details.
Stocks in the U.S. tumbled on Tuesday following the purchase of First Republic Bank by banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 367.17 points, or 1.08% on Tuesday, ending the session at 33,684.53. The S&P 500 slipped 1.16%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq lost 1.08%. Analysts attributed the tumbling stocks to investors' fears that the turmoil in the banking sector could spread to other regional banks after witnessing Tuesday's takeover of First Republic, the third bank failure in the U.S. this year. Some of the sharpest drops came from small and mid-sized banks. Shares of Los Angeles-based PacWest Bancorp fell 27.8%, Western Alliance Bank was down 15.1%, and Comerica lost 12.4%. The KBW Regional Banking Index fell 5.52% to its lowest point since December 2020. Big banks were no exception. J.P. Morgan Chase, whose shares saw a 2% gain after the announcement of its takeover deal on Monday, fell 1.6%. Wells Fargo fell 4.7% and Bank of America dropped 3.9%. Experts also pointed to the Federal Reserve's upcoming rate hike decision on Wednesday as another factor that led to the drop. Many are expecting the Fed to raise its key interest rate by 25 basis points to 5.25%, the highest in 16 years.
The consensus is that they're going to do another quarter hike tomorrow. What will they say and what they won't say? And that's the huge question mark for the markets tomorrow.
Investors tend to be cautious if a rate hike is likely, as higher rates mean the stock market will be declining in value. 송유진, Arirang News.
Also aggravating anxiety within the U.S. stock market is talk about a potential government default. Back on Monday, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned that the U.S. may run out of cash by June 1st if U.S. Congress fails to raise, that is, or suspend the debt ceiling to allow the government to borrow more money. Republicans, however, are calling for spending cuts to accompany the raising of the borrowing limit. President Joe Biden is poised to meet with Republican and Democratic leaders next Tuesday at the White House to further address the matter. London will be hosting the coronation ceremony for King Charles III this coming Saturday. Now, it's the first coronation in 7 decades, but it will be smaller in size and shorter in duration in consideration of the country's current cost of living crisis. Our Eunjin has more.
The last coronation of a member of the British royal family was 70 years ago, when then 27-year-old Queen Elizabeth II began her reign. And on Saturday, the ancient ritual will take place again for the coronation of King Charles III and the crowning of his wife, Queen Consort Camilla. King Charles becomes the oldest to accede to the throne at the age of 73 years. Taking charge of the ceremony at Westminster Abbey will be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Some 2,000 guests have been invited, including foreign royals and heads of state. The king has opted for a smaller, shorter, and more diverse ceremony than for his mother's coronation in 1953. The festivities will last all weekend, running into Monday, which has been proclaimed a public holiday nationwide. Events include colorful parades, public concerts, spectacular light shows, and thousands of street parties across the UK and the Commonwealth. Among the guests, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is due to attend, alongside cabinet ministers and peers from the House of Lords, and former UK Prime Ministers like Theresa May and Tony Blair. US President Joe Biden will not be attending himself, but has confirmed that First Lady Jill Biden will take his place. It is also understood that religious leaders and representatives from across the Commonwealth will attend. Critics have questioned the cost of the lavish coronation at a time when the public is facing economic hardship and struggling with a cost of living crisis. To this, a palace spokesperson pointed to reports that more than £1 billion, that's roughly $1.25 billion US, was expected to flow into the struggling economy on the back of the event. And having so many heads of state present was also a huge networking opportunity. 이은진, Arirang News.
Back here at home, a former garrison for American forces near the presidential office has been transformed into a garden for families, poised to open to the public tomorrow afternoon. Our senior top office correspondent Hwacheon-gun had a preview.
A scenic space to find freedom, openness and a peace of mind. Seoul is opening a large public garden in the central district of Yongsan, in place of a former military compound that shunned South Koreans from its gates for over a century. President Yoon on Tuesday hosted an outdoor lunch for media at the pine grass lawn within the Yongsan Children's Garden ahead of its official opening at 2 p.m. on Thursday. Dedicated to future generations, Yoon said he envisioned the garden as a place for children to run and play freely on the grass. Thursday's opening comes just a few days before the first anniversary of President Yoon's inauguration. The timing highlighted the South Korean leader's push for freedom and openness as he expressed willingness to spend more time with media to communicate freely and asked them to help in building a brighter future for the nation. Located in front of the presidential office, with the National Museum of Korea to its side, the garden represents Yoon's pledge to communicate with and be closer to the people when he relocated his office to the Yongsan district. The opening of the garden gates is also historically significant for South Koreans. The 230,000 square meters of greenery is now being returned to the Korean public after it was occupied for 120 years, first by Imperial Japanese troops who installed the main entrance, then gradually converted into a US military base upon South Korea's liberation in 1945. Soon it will be open to all, featuring a huge lawn area as its centerpiece with a sports field to its east. To the west, a trail of houses with red tile roofs, formerly home to US military officials, stretches from the main entrance. Key locations include archives, a library and a hall that unwinds the location's decades of history in photos and records, from Japan's brutal colonization to the years of war between the two Koreas, bringing visitors to the present day where South Korea stands as a liberal democracy. To mark the launch of the garden, the exhibition hall will hold a light-themed display, and children's football and baseball games will kick off on the opening day. The opening hours are 9 a.m. to 6 p.m, with prior reservation required for first-time visitors. Reservations can be made on the Yongsan Children's Garden website 5 days in advance for Korean citizens and 10 days for foreign visitors. Hwacheon-gun, Arirang News.
And there is a place here in South Korea that remains a solid symbol of future peace on the Korean peninsula, even amid the current heightened tensions between the two countries. Our defense correspondent Kim Hyun-sung was there.
Welcome to Hwacheon-gun County, a stunning area of Gangwon-do province near the border between North and South Korea. It's also home to many symbols of peace, like the Peace Dam on Paro Lake.
This is Paro Lake, the only freshwater lake in South Korea that has waters directly flowing in from north of the border. And this ship is taking us to the Peace Dam. It's the closest dam that South Korea has to the DMZ line, and it was built to stop waters flooding in from the north.
Not too far from the lake is also the World Peace Bell. The makers of the bell collected around 37.5 tons of empty shells from wars around the world to create the bell, which they left incomplete, with the hope of finishing it on the day when the two Koreas reunite in peace. Anyone can ring the bell when they visit, symbolizing their commitment to peace.
Hwacheon has a painful history of war, but it was also the site of victory. It's where people come to see the sacrifices made behind the freedom that we enjoy today.
At Hwacheon-gun County, tourists can also take South Korea's highest reaching cable car to the top of Baegansan Mountain, more than 1 kilometer above sea level. On a clear day, visitors can catch a glimpse of North Korea in the distance. However, due to the limited capacity of the cable car, only a couple hundred tourists can experience this unique opportunity each day. Despite being just a short distance away, North Korea remains a mystery to most of the world, with decades of separation between the two Koreas. Nevertheless, Hwacheon-gun County stands as a symbol of hope for a peaceful reunification. Kim Yeon-seung, Arirang News, Hwacheon.
And over in Jeju, electric vehicle makers have descended on the southern resort island to showcase their latest designs and technology. Our business correspondent Shin Ha-young files this report.
Jeju Island has been playing a leading role in increasing the number of electric vehicles in South Korea under its initiative of being a carbon-free island by 2030. The International Electric Vehicle Expo, an annual showcase of eco-friendly vehicles, got underway on the island on Tuesday for its 10th run, offering visitors a glimpse of both the present and future of EVs. During the event's opening ceremony, the governor of Jeju reiterated the island's current status regarding eco-friendly vehicles.
EV distribution on Jeju surpassed 30,000 last year and currently has the highest distribution rate among other regions of the country. Jeju is now also embarking on a new challenge, which is building a global green hydrogen hub.
More than 200 companies, including EV manufacturers, battery makers, and charging infrastructure-related firms have participated in the exhibition. Woojin Industrial Systems, which is recognized as a key player in the domestic electric bus production sector, showcased its latest innovation, South Korea's first ever dual-door electric bus model. This electric bus is equipped with a high-efficiency battery that can travel up to 412 kilometers, and several local governments have been reviewing it as an option for their public transportation in their cities. The exhibition also has an eco-friendly electric road sweeper on display. With the characteristics of an EV, it produces less driving and operational noise, making it easier to work in the early hours of the morning. This ultra-compact electric cargo vehicle is convenient for entering complex and narrow city alleys.
Existing vehicles like the Porter or one-ton cargo trucks are too big to drive around in the city. On the other hand, our vehicle, that's an appropriate size for the city, can handle the logistics while being better for the environment and easing congestion.
The exhibition will run until this Friday. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News, Jeju.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Kenya, a religious cult leader accused of encouraging hundreds of followers to starve themselves to death is facing charges of murder, terrorism, and child trafficking. Paul Nthenge Mackenzie, a self-proclaimed pastor and founder of the Good News International Church, appeared in court in the Kenyan town of Malindi on Tuesday, alongside 8 other defendants. It was decided to move the case to a high court in Mombasa, where the defendants will be held in a maximum security prison. Mackenzie allegedly told his followers that they would meet Jesus if they starved themselves. Authorities have since confirmed that 109 people linked to his cult are dead, most of them children. Autopsies confirmed that most died of starvation, with 2 people likely dying by asphyxiation. The death toll is expected to rise as another 300 people are reportedly still missing. Turning over to the United Kingdom, a man has been arrested for allegedly throwing what is thought to be shotgun cartridges into the grounds of Buckingham Palace on Tuesday evening local time. The man was taken into custody on suspicion of having an offensive weapon. Police later found that he was in possession of a knife. A controlled explosion was carried out at the scene as a precautionary measure. The incident comes just 4 days ahead of the official coronation of the king, but reports say King Charles III and the Queen Consort Camilla were not at the palace at the time. According to authorities, the matter is not terror-related and may be an isolated mental health incident. Now, in a crackdown on e-cigarettes and the tobacco industry, Australia is banning recreational vaping. The government on Tuesday said it aims to ban all disposable vapes and the import of non-prescription vapes. It also aims to limit nicotine levels in e-cigarettes and to ensure they are sold solely to help smokers quit. They will only be sold in pharmacies with pharmaceutical-type packaging, and a selection of flavors will be banned. The new measures come amid an increasing number of teens vaping. Although access to vaping products already requires a prescription, it has not stopped these from being widely available through illegal markets. Vaping is considered a safer alternative to tobacco-based cigarettes, but health experts warn that it may cause long-term harm. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Other than big gaps in ratings, the weather has been quite pleasant for the last couple of days. Today, warm southwesterly winds are bringing up afternoon highs to warmer than norms in central parts of the country, feeling more like early summer under bright skies. Even the air quality will be normal to good nationwide all day, while southern provinces are seeing more clouds than sunshine with cooler highs this afternoon. Now enjoy the warmth and sunshine if you can today, because we are expecting a weather shift from tomorrow to murky and wet conditions. It will start to rain from Jeju late this afternoon, gradually spreading to Jeollado province by tomorrow morning. Then the entire country will have rain from tomorrow afternoon. And it could pour down on Children's Day this Friday along with strong winds. So do plan accordingly for the day. Rain continues until Saturday, which is Ipha, the beginning of summer on the seasonal calendar. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions. That is all we have for this Wednesday afternoon newscast. We have our panel session coming up in a few minutes, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.
Italy, Contour, India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
한번 2분.
Lotus Lantern Festival. Let the festival begin. We desire to share Korea's proud culture with the world. So that people can have a time of healing just by watching and become happy as they enjoy the festival. So that joy can stay in their hearts the moment they encounter our festival. That is the reason we want to share our culture with the world. Welcome to Lotus Lantern Festival, Seoul, Korea.
President Yoon summit last Wednesday with his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. will be followed by a summit with his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida this Sunday here in Seoul as the three leaders seek to strengthen their trilateral alliance against regional security concerns. So is the trilateral alliance aggravating tensions with China and Russia amid North Korea's provocations? Meanwhile, what are the prospects of a peace framework between Ukraine and Russia brokered by China? And what looks to top the summit agenda between President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida?
Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we shed light on the lingering divide between South Korea, the US, as well as Japan, and North Korea, Russia, as well as China over a range of geopolitical issues. For this, I have Professor Hwacheon-gun from Kyunghee University here in the studio. Professor Choi, it's a pleasure.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Kwon So with us. So it's good to see you again.
Hello, Sunny.
Right, so let's start with you then. Let's begin with the messages shared by Presidents Yoon and Joe Biden during their summit with regard to China and Russia, respectively.
Sure. So let me refer to the joint statement that Presidents Yoon and President Joe Biden announced following their summit. So starting with the message at Russia, South Korea and the U.S. condemned Russia's war against Ukraine and especially did so in the strongest possible terms when it comes to Moscow's attacks against civilians and important infrastructure. They also stated that both Seoul and Washington have responded firmly to Russia's clear violations against international law by supporting sanctions and export control measures. The two allies also stressed they stand with Ukraine in its defense for its sovereignty and territorial integrity and vowed for continuous support in various ways. Now, in respect to China, publicly, there was no direct mentioning of the country. In fact, the word China came up once in the roughly 2,700 words long statement, but even so, it was the South China Sea that was mentioned when Presidents Yoon and Biden reaffirmed they are committed to preserving the lawful use of the sea, including in the South China Sea and beyond. But what we and other media assumed, I have to say what I assumed just last week to have been a message to China was in the part where the South Korean and U.S. leaders renewed the importance of preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, where they went on to say they strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the Indo-Pacific, including through unlawful maritime claims, the militarization of reclaimed features, and coercive activities. And experts have assessed that the latest statement demonstrates a stronger support by the South Korean president for the U.S. on the matter. And that's also what China had felt, given its strong protest following following the summit, calling the Seoul-Washington statement erroneous. However, Seoul explained to Beijing that the joint statement was not targeting any specific country, but was simply about affirming the existing stance, that is, that South Korea has on the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And also it was about expanding future-oriented cooperation between Seoul and Washington.
Right, and keeping in mind what Soya has just said, Professor Che, some say strong ties between South Korea, Japan and the US appear to be aggravating the standoff with China and Russia. Do you agree?
I partly agree. Beijing and Moscow are not welcoming Seoul's stronger ties with Tokyo and Washington. For example, they were upset about President Yoon's recent comments on the Taiwan question and the war in Ukraine, right before he visited Washington. So President Yoon opposed the idea of using force in the Taiwan Strait. Then the Chinese foreign minister responded, saying anyone interfering the issue is playing with fire. And Moscow also threatened heavy consequence for South Korea if Korea provides lethal weapons to Ukraine. But this standoff with China and Russia should be understood in the context of Korea's new vision of global pivotal state. This vision foresees Korea making a more active contribution to the world peace and prosperity as a defender of freedom, human rights, and also rule-based international order in partnership with Washington and Tokyo. And I think this diplomatic transformation of South Korea are somewhat surprising China and Russia because they have never thought of it before. Thus, we need to talk to China and Russia more about this vision so there should be no misunderstanding of this South Korea's new diplomatic vision.
Right, and speaking about Russia, so do tell us a bit about Russia's response to the Washington declaration aimed at countering North Korea's nuclear brinkmanship.
Well, Moscow was critical of the Washington declaration, which was adopted at the Yoon-Biden summit with an aim of upgrading the security alliance between South Korea and the U.S. to a nuclear-based new paradigm. Now, that's the latest wordings that President Yoon used while assessing the new agreement back here in Seoul. Now, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said in a statement that Russia took note of the reports on the agreement reached between the U.S. and South Korea on a joint planning in regards to the use of nuclear weapons, and she denounced the development as being clearly destabilizing in nature, adding it will bring, quote, serious negative consequences for regional security, projecting onto global stability. Zakharova went on to criticize the U.S. and its allies for what she called a search for determinative military superiority and accused them of blatantly outlining so-called extended nuclear deterrent schemes, which she said are potentially destructive to international security, claiming Washington has been practicing such moves within NATO for decades.
Right, indeed. Professor Che, during President Yoon's state visit to the U.S., Russian submarines conducted naval drills in the East Sea. How do you interpret the timing of these particular drills?
As you said, the Russian Navy, especially the Pacific Fleet, mobilized large destroyers in the East Sea in its training to detect and destroy enemy submarine. So according to reports, the Russian Navy trained on the assumption that unidentified submarine appeared in the Russian waters in the East Sea. So earlier on the 24th, the Russia announced that it would conduct anti-submarine drills in the East Sea based on its usual combat training plan. But as you mentioned, the timing of the Russian drill is so interesting because it happened during President Yoon's state visit to Washington, where the United States agreed to deploy nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea for the first time since the 1980s. Frankly, it is hard to know the true motivations for this naval drill. Perhaps I think think Moscow wants to send some signal to growing military ties between Seoul and Washington as a balancing move. But what is more important than the timing is that Seoul should not overreact to such a Russian move at this time.
Right, I see. And so Chinese President Xi Jinping and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held talks over the phone regarding a possible peace settlement in Ukraine amid Russia's invasion. Could you tell us a bit about the details of that particular exchange?
Sure. So this was the first ever known phone conversation between Presidents Xi and Zelensky ever since Russia's invasion in Ukraine in February last year. And the gist of the almost an hour-long talk seems to be that China is reaching out to Ukraine to seek a role as a neutral peace broker. According to Chinese state broadcaster CCTV, Chinese President Xi told his Ukrainian counterpart that China, quote, always stood on the side of peace when it comes to the Ukraine crisis, and Beijing's core position is to promote peace talks. With that, Xi was trying to convey China's objective and impartial position on international affairs, is what media reports say. The Chinese leader also expressed his will to send a special envoy to Ukraine to hold talks with all parties involved in the conflict. So this is in line with a paper that China published back in February on ending the war through a political settlement on the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. Now, after the talks with his Chinese counterpart, Zelensky said he had a long and meaningful phone call with Xi, and that he believes that this call and the appointment of Ukraine's ambassador to China, which also occurred on the same day of the phone talk, so last Wednesday, will give a quote, powerful impetus to the development of our bilateral relations. So some positive prospects coming from the Ukrainian president, but we will have to see whether China really could be a game changer in this.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Che, what are the prospects of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia brokered by China?
There are both positive and negative aspects of Beijing's mediation efforts between Russia and Ukraine. So positive side first. The Beijing does have a significant leverage over Moscow because Moscow is becoming heavily dependent on China in the middle of economic sanctions imposed by the West. So China's trade with Russia hit a record high level of $190 billion in 2022. It was a 30% rise compared to year 2021. But the question is whether Xi Jinping is willing to use this strong leverage to force Putin to make some concessions on the negotiation table with Zelensky. And the second one is the negative side. Xi Jinping is too close to Putin and very supportive of Russia in the past. And we all know that Russia and China has a very friendly relationship. So therefore, it would be very hard for Zelensky to accept what Xi Jinping may suggest to him. And after all, the question is whether Xi is willing and able to play neutral broker between all warring parties. And I guess this is not an easy task.
I see. And beyond that, Professor Che, what would you say are the implications of China's growing presence on the global stage on South Korea?
I agree that we will encounter a greater Chinese presence and also influence, especially in East Asia. So, for example, as I said earlier, Russia has been separated from the West due to Ukraine war, and therefore Russia has become dependent on China. And also North Korea has no choice but to stay closer to China. And as a result, the solidarity of the Northern Triangle, including North Korea, China, and Russia, reappeared on the Korean Peninsula. And also South Korea is likely to work with the United States and Japan to establish a new Southern Triangle relationship. However, the Korea needs to strengthen strategic relations with its ally, but also manage relations with neighboring China. in a friendly manner because Korea-China relations currently have huge economic and security implications for Korea. So what South Korea can do at this point is to further strengthen its strategic alliance with the United States and continue to send positive and friendly signals to China that Korea can play a constructive role in resolving conflict and coordination in the current U.S.-China competition. And secondly, it is necessary to explain to China that the Korean vision of global pivotal state is an inclusive strategy that does not exclude or target any specific countries.
Right. That, of course, will be one way of balancing the ties between its security ties with the U.S. and its economic ties with China, of course. So, contrary to speculations, that is, ahead of the Yoon-Biden summit, the presidential office here says potential military aid to Ukraine by South Korea was not addressed. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Right. Seoul's presidential office said there was no mentioning of military support to Ukraine at the bilateral summit, adding that South Korea maintains its official policy of not providing any lethal weapons to Ukraine. However, rumors on the possibility of more than humanitarian and economic aid from South Korea didn't appear out of nowhere. President Yoon Suk-yeol himself had hinted that there could be more options during an interview ahead of the summit, also a Q&A session after a lecture at Harvard Kennedy School during his visit to the U.S., and also weeks ago during another interview. And those comments were to quite an extent cited in foreign media as well. And the Ukrainian ambassador just last month had also welcomed Seoul's gesture of possibly providing arms to Ukraine. Whether that could realize in the future or not, we can not say as of now. But as the presidential office brushed off that this was a topic mentioned at the Yoon-Biden summit, it's not likely to happen in the near future. However, if we draw our attention back to the summit statement, I earlier purposely did not read out the detailed part on Presidents Yoon and Biden referring to their assistance to Ukraine. It says they continue to support Ukraine through the vital provision of political, security, humanitarian, and economic assistance. So the security part in the joint statement may also be hinting towards a possibly aid beyond humanitarian or economic support. Although it also could be within the frame of non-lethal military aid, so that we cannot say for sure.
Right, I see. And Professor Che, then, what do you believe would be perhaps the broader ripple effects of military aid to Ukraine by South Korea?
This is a very tough question.
It is.
Let me talk about just possible worst-case scenario. This worst-case scenario is a Russian supply of weapons to North Korea. And in fact, the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, issued a threatening statement on April 19th, warning that Russia may supply weapons to Pyongyang if South Korea decides to supply weapons to Ukraine. So this statement came in response to President Yoon Suk-yeol's recent announcement that South Korea may extend its support to Ukraine beyond the humanitarian and economic aid. So this is the most likely ripple effect of military aid to Ukraine by South Korea, but I hope this scenario is not realized.
Right, I'm sure many hope the same. Meanwhile, so what has been the response in neighboring Japan with regard to the Yoon-Biden summit?
Well, Japanese media emphasized the trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo that the two leaders mentioned in their joint statement, highlighting it as an important cooperation. And as part of that, they also underlined President Biden's welcoming of President Yoon's bold steps towards improving Seoul-Tokyo ties. And that was an apparent reference to President Yoon's recent efforts in trying to kind of alleviate historical tensions between South Korea and Japan when he was in Japan for a summit just recently, meeting with his Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. And conservative media outlets in particular praised Presidents Yoon and Biden's forge on a tougher nuclear umbrella against North Korea. So speaking about the Washington Declaration, saying that the two allies have reaffirmed their trust towards each other when it comes to responding against North Korea's threats, so on the security level. And the Sankei Shimbun even suggested their own leader, Prime Minister Kishida, could learn from Yoon's actions. Now, the liberal Mainichi Shimbun, meanwhile, expressed some doubts on how much of a tangible, strengthened, extended deterrence the recent agreements under the Washington Declaration could actually bring, saying it might be not much more than an expression of will. And it also mentioned the possibility of increased provocations from North Korea, as we also heard Biden having a message towards North Korea's regime in the latest joint statement.
Right, indeed. Professor Che, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, as Hoa mentioned, will be here in Seoul this coming Sunday for summit talks with President Yoon Suk-yeol. That being said, what do you suppose looks to top the agenda during the summit talks between the two leaders?
I expect responding to the North Korean issue and also cooperation in the security and economic sectors will be the main agenda of this upcoming summit. And I also expect that the implementation of the first labor solution announced by the Korean government last month will be discussed. Especially both leaders will accelerate security cooperation by exchanging opinions on the situation in North Korea, which is now planning to launch a military reconnaissance satellite. And also, lastly, and more importantly, there will be much attention on whether Prime Minister Kishida will make a direct apology to the victims of Japan's first labor mobilization when he visits Seoul. So there is some domestic criticism in South Korea that there is no clear apology from Japan. So the key is how the Prime Minister will mention it during this summit.
Right, and that would be the task for the Japanese side. That being said, then, Professor Che, what are some tasks that remain ahead for the Yoon administration following its summit with the Biden administration and its upcoming summit with the Kishida administration?
The greatest achievement of this Korea-US summit is the Washington Declaration, I think. And in this declaration, the United States has formed a consultative body with South Korea for nuclear deterrence. For the first time in history, the United States rarely discusses its nuclear operating system as well as sharing information with any other alliance except NATO. So moreover, the Washington Declaration stated that the United States strategic assets, including the strategic nuclear submarines, would deploy on the Korean Peninsula on a regular basis. And any nuclear attacks against South Korea would face immediate and decisive response. And therefore, I believe that the Washington Declaration opened a new horizon for the Korea-US alliance. And based on this, we should further demonstrate the Korea's security interests and diplomatic capabilities in the future. I hope the Yoon administration will make good use of this right to speak and share nuclear information with Washington for the safety of our people.
Right, probably transparent cooperation with its allies then. Yeah. All right, Professor Che, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And so as always, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Thursday.
Busan, Korea is already reaching the entire world. Like ocean waves that travel far and wide. It's Busan, the perfect World Expo city. Transforming our world, navigating toward a better future. World Expo 2030, Busan, Korea.
Hello, I'm Jernej Müller, Ambassador of Slovenia to the Republic of Korea. Right now, I see Korea shining in the world. Korea has many strengths, and the global presence is already here. Slovenia will continue to establish the presence in the international scene. This is also one of the reasons why we opened the embassy in Korea last year. I always thank Arirang TV for playing a big role in promoting Korean information to the world so that many people can access Korean content and get to know all aspects of Korean culture. I hope that people around the world will continue to communicate and sympathize with Korea. Resonating the world, Arirang.